Gracious! You weren't kidding when you said your house was a construction zone. Shooting her sister a quick look, Jill maneuvered the car around several piles of lumber and pulled up by her back door. Keith doesn't waste any time. When is the dump truck coming, Aunt Jill? 7-year-old Dominic had ditched his seatbelt the instant the house came into view and was now bouncing around in the back, trying to take it all in. Tomorrow. I hope you weren't planning to sleep in. I like to get up early, he assured her. Deb rolled her eyes. Why couldn't I have a normal kid who sleeps till noon in the summer? Hey, I'm a normal kid, Dominique protested. Above normal, I'd say, Jill added. Except when it comes to sleeping in. Deb stifled a yawn. Sorry, it's been a long day. You could have picked somewhere to live that was easier to get to, you know? I didn't want a place that was easy to get to. And stop complaining. Tourists pay a lot of money to come to this island. You're lucky you have a free place to stay. Yeah, a construction site. Setting the brake, Jill poked her sister in the ribs. Too bad Keith's in the cabin, or I'd put you out there. A mock shudder passed through Deb. No, thank you. Once was enough. I still remember waking up that first night to find a dare staring at me through the window. Talk about freaking out. As a city girl, I prefer to view the wildlife from a distance, a long distance, like on the TV screen. Tell Keith that when you see him. When he heard you were coming, he wanted to move out, so you'd have a place to stay. It was all I could do to convince him that you prefer the house, cramped as it is. Hey, I'm used to sharing a bed. Besides, you take up less room than Tony, and you don't snore. But don't ever tell him I said that. Chuckling, Jill looked back at Dominique. I hate relegating Dominique to a sleeping bag on the floor, though. Are you kidding? He loves it. He thinks it's an adventure. Right, Dominique? The youngster was already opening the door, oblivious to the adults' conversation. Can I look at all that stuff, Aunt Jill? Sure, but don't touch anything until Keith is around. Where is your tenant, anyway? Deb dropped her sunglasses into her purse. In the cabin, I expect. You'll see him tomorrow. Jill opened the door and stepped out. I'm looking forward to meeting him. Why? Curious, I guess. Any man who could convince you to take him in has to be special. Lifting the trunk, Jill ignored Deb's comment and hefted out one of her suitcases. What did you bring anyway? The kitchen sink? That's what Dad said when he dropped us off at the airport. Dominic chimed in with a grin. Very funny. I only brought the absolute necessities, Deb returned back to Jill. You're avoiding the question. I didn't hear one. Jill handed Deb one of the bags. She should have figured her sister wouldn't drop the subject. What makes this guy special? I didn't say he was. You didn't have to. His mere presence is proof enough. Is he one of those hunky construction types, all muscles and hard at? Planting her head on her hips, Jill gave her sister an annoyed look. He's just a nice guy, okay? A bit scruffy, but nice. Uh-huh. Okay, fine. Jill threw up her hands. You can check him out for yourself tomorrow. Oh, I intend to, dear sister. First thing tomorrow after a good night's sleep. As it happened, first thing tomorrow turned out to be 7 o'clock, when the rumble of a dump truck straining to ascend the drive broke the early morning stillness. Jill was up, of course. She'd always been an early riser, and Dominic hadn't been too far behind. He was already in the shower. Last time she'd looked, Deb had still been dead to the world. Her slumber wouldn't last long with the racket that was coming from outside, though. Since she saw no sign of Keith, Jill stepped onto the back porch, pulling her hat low over her face as she moved to the edge of the railing. A burly man was surveying the wooden forms Keith had built for the foundation and footing. I'm afraid my construction manager isn't here yet, Jill called to him from the shadows. Shading his eyes, he peered up at her. That's okay. I'm a little early. Keith says 7:30, but I thought it would take me longer to get here than it did. I don't come out this way much. Mighty pretty spot, though. Thanks. Would you like a cup of coffee while you wait? No, thanks. Always bring my own Java. The man held up a thermos and grinned. Nobody brews it as strong as I like. Pure grounds, the wife says. With a wave and a smile, Jill headed back inside. Deb was just walking into the kitchen, bleary-eyed, her short blonde hair sticking out in all directions, her skin wiped clean of makeup. She wore faded jeans and a long, shapeless t-shirt that helped disguise the few extra pounds she'd been trying to lose for the past 5 years. You weren't kidding about an early morning, were you? She groused good-naturedly. Nope. But look on the bright side. Since the concrete has to cure for a few days, it shouldn't be too noisy during the rest of your day. Want some coffee? I could be talked into it. As Jill poured a hearty cup and added a healthy dose of cream and sugar, she glimpsed Keith through the window on the far side of the meadow. Well, you're about to get your first look at my tenant, she told Deb, handing her the coffee. That perked up her sister. Wrapping her hands around the mug, she moved to the window. Where? Oh, I see him. Sort of. The sun's shining right in my eyes. Besides, I don't have my contacts in yet. She squinted, then shook her head. No good. I'll have to wait until he gets out of the glare and comes closer. A few minutes later, when the sound of male voices drifted in the open window on the other side of the kitchen, Deb made a move in that direction. Jill grabbed her arm and gave her a stern look. It's not polite to eavesdrop. I just want to get a look at him. I'll introduce you as soon as he's done talking to the cement guy. Be patient. Making a face, Deb opened the refrigerator and began scrounging around. So what's for breakfast? How about pancakes? The ones we had on our last visit were fabulous. I dreamed about them for weeks after we went home. I told Tony that I wasn't even going to worry about my diet while I was out here. I mean, what good is a vacation if you can't? A sharp rap at the back door interrupted her, and she straightened. Jill flashed her a grin. See? Everything comes to those who wait. As she pulled open the door to usher Keith in, Jill turned to Deb, planning to introduce her. But at her sister's incredulous expression, the words died in her throat. Deb's mouth had dropped open, and the hand holding her mug was frozen halfway to her mouth. The way she was gaping at Keith was downright embarrassing, and hot color suffused Jill's cheeks. It wasn't like her sister to be rude, even if her tenant was a little scruffy and rough around the edges. But his appearance didn't call for the kind of reaction Deb was having. Struggling to find some words to smooth over her sister's impoliteness, Jill turned to Keith and had exactly the same response as she stared in shock at the man beside her. A man transformed. Gone was the shaggy mane. His medium brown hair was now cut in a short, fashionable style. The stubble had disappeared too, revealing a strong, clean-shaven jaw with an endearing cleft in the center that reminded her of Cary Grant. In the 2 weeks he'd been on the island, he'd also filled out a bit, and the angular bone structure of his face had softened. His jeans fit as if they'd been designed for him, and his snug t-shirt called attention to his broad chest and impressive biceps. A flicker of amusement deepened the cobalt blue of his eyes as he took in the reaction of the two women. When the silence lengthened, he took the initiative. Good morning, ladies. You must be Deb. I'm Keith Michaels. He moved over to Deb and extended his hand. For once, her sister seemed at a loss for words. She took his hand, then cleared her throat. Hello. Grinning, Keith turned to Jill. Sorry for the early start. I didn't expect the cement to arrive for at least another half hour. But he won't be there long. I hope we didn't disturb anyone. All Jill could manage was a shake of her head. Still grinning, he disappeared through the door, leaving shocked silence in his wake. "I thought you said he looked scruffy," Deb croaked when she located her voice. "He did. You could have warned me, you know," her sister continued, as if she hadn't heard Jill's reply. "About what?" Propping her hands on her hips, Deb shook her head. "Jill, I know you've been out of circulation for a while, but surely you can still recognize good looks when you see them." Staring down at her clothes, Deb groaned and ran a hand through her hair. "I'm a mess. Talk about a bad first impression." "You look fine. And what does it matter anyways? You're happily married. It's not like you're trying to attract a guy." "My dear sister, a woman always likes to be noticed by a handsome man. It's good for the ego." She moved over to the window and peeked through the curtain. "Who is this guy anyway? The way you described him, I thought he was some down on his luck drifter. Now that I've seen him, no way. I don't know anything about him, except that he's been on the road for a while." Turning back, Deb gave her sister a skeptical look. "The man's been living on your property for 2 weeks, and that's all you found out?" "I didn't want to pry." Prying and showing interest are two different things. Deb's face grew thoughtful. "I see my work is cut out for me." "Deb," the warning note in Jill's voice was clear. "He seems like a very private person. Don't push." "When have I ever pushed?" Deb gave her an innocent look. "Deb." "Okay, okay, I promise to behave. Or at least try to behave." That was as good as she was going to get, and Jill knew it. Unfortunately, it left plenty of wiggle room. "So what brought you to Orcas Island, Keith?" Jill kicked a Deb under the table. They'd only been eating a few minutes, and already her sister was edging into private territory. Deb ignored her, keeping her attention fixed on Keith as she smoothed one stray strand of her perfectly coiffed hair. "Would you like some more lemonade, Keith?" Jill offered. "Yes, thanks." As she picked up the pitcher, Jill suspected that Keith was already sorry he'd agreed to have lunch with them. Since the two of them had reached their barter agreement, they'd been sharing a hot lunch every day. But he'd insisted that they suspend that arrangement during Deb's visit, claiming he didn't want to intrude on family time. However, when Deb found out about it, she'd put her foot down, saying she didn't want anyone to alter their routine because she and Dominic were visiting. After Keith had continued to demur, she'd threatened to go down into town for meals. In the end, he capitulated, a decision he was now regretting, Jill suspected. When she finished pouring the lemonade, Jill was tempted to spill some on her sister's fashionable capri pants and matching top. Enough that she'd have to excuse herself to clean up. Of course, that wouldn't be nice, but it would get her off Keith's back for a few minutes. Her hand hovered for a brief second, long enough for Deb to shoot her a suspicious look. In the end, Jill returned the pitcher to its spot on the table, relying on prayer to keep her sister in check. Too bad God wasn't listening. We were talking about your visit here, Keith, Deb prompted. I've been doing some traveling, and this area sounded interesting. Where's your house base? Keith hesitated, causing Jill to wonder if he was just reluctant to share that information, or if he didn't have one. I left on my travels from Missouri. Well, isn't that a coincidence? Jill lived in Kansas before she came out here. You were almost neighbors. Have some turkey, Deb. Jill shoved the platter at her. I think I will. She helped herself, looking at the food instead of her sister. I always eat way too much when I come out here. Jill is such a good cook. I used to tell her she could open up a restaurant, but she loved being an art teacher. Besides, those hours were hard enough to manage with a family, let alone trying to run a restaurant. Do you have a family, Keith? The volleys were coming so fast, Keith was having difficulty keeping up. Not just because he was dodging the questions, but because he was also trying to assimilate the new information he was getting about Jill. He'd known she was a widow, but he'd known nothing of a family, as in children. The news startled him, and he shifted his attention to her even as he tried to frame a response to Deb's question. Her gaze met his, and he saw apology in her eyes. He wished he could assure her that her sister's queries didn't bother him, but that would be a lie. Still, if the reward for revealing a little about himself was additional background on Jill, he considered it a fair trade. No, my wife died a couple of years ago, and we didn't have children. As Jill tried to process that bombshell, compassion softened Deb's features. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Have you always been a carpenter, Keith? Until now, Dominic had been too busy eating to pay attention to the adult conversation. But as he started in on his second helping of turkey, his pace slowed. He'd been following Keith around all morning, awed by the man's deft handling of tools and the lumber. Now, it seemed, he was Deb's ally and the interrogation, except his interest was innocent. Turning his attention to the youngster, Keith smiled. Not always. How did you learn to do all that stuff? My dad's a carpenter. He was a great teacher. My dad's a lawyer. He works in an office and goes to court to talk to judges and help people who are in trouble. Good for him. Jill sure could have used your help when she first moved out here. Deb joined in, directing her comment to Keith. Rehabbing this house was no small job. You rehab this house? Keith angled his head toward Jill. The whole place, top to bottom, Deb answered for her. It was a wreck. She stripped wallpaper and woodwork, refinished the floors, replaced siding, painted. She did an amazing job. Impressed, Keith looked over at her. No wonder she had such a well-equipped tool shed. I agree. A flush rose on Jill's cheeks. It was mostly cosmetic. It was a lot more than that. You couldn't have gotten me to tackle this for all the tea in China, Deb declared. This is really good, Aunt Jill. Her nephew was buttering his third roll. Thanks, Dominique. And we have brownie sundaes for dessert. Awesome. He tilted his head back and inspected her as he chewed, then gave her a gap-toothed grin. Hey, you know what? Your face looks better this year. Dominique! Deb's reproving tone had little impact on the youngster. Well, it does. There was a stubborn tilt to his chin as he responded to his mother before turning back to Jill. And your eyes are happier too. At the sudden speculative look on Deb's face, Jill decided to clear the table. Okay, on to dessert. Rising, Keith reached for Dominique's plate. Let me help. You don't need to do that. I want to. Rather than argue, Jill gathered up a stack of dishes and headed for the kitchen, Keith close on her heels. When she deposited her load on the counter, she took a deep breath and faced him. I'm sorry about that. A grin teased his lips. Your sister missed her calling. I think the FBI or CIA could use her for interrogation work. She can be a little pushy. At least the trait doesn't seem to run in the family. An answering smile played at the corners of her mouth. I think I inherited my mom's diplomacy. Deb got my dad's inquisitiveness. Then her expression grew earnest. But she's a wonderful person. I couldn't have survived without her after the... Her voice choked, and she clamped her lips shut. Hey, I like your sister. He laid a reassuring hand on Jill's slender shoulder. I wasn't offended. The warmth of his fingers seeped through the fabric of her blouse, and her heart skipped a beat. I'm glad, but I think I also owe you an apology for this morning. I'm sorry that we stared. You just looked different. This time he gave her a full-fledged grin. It's okay. I am flattered. Assuming different means better. Without giving her a chance to confirm or deny, he rubbed a hand over his clean-shaven jaw and spoke again. I have to admit I feel more human again since I ditched the refugee look. Why did you do it? He considered her question. I suppose I didn't want your sister to think you'd taken in a derelict. And it was time. Before she could ask him to clarify that ambiguous comment, he glanced over her shoulder and changed the subject. Nice glassware collection, by the way. I've been meaning to compliment you on it. The pieces really catch the light. Half turning, Jill surveyed the rainbow-colored vases and bowls that were displayed on the shelves above the half wall that separated the kitchen from the living room. I rescued them from the garage sales when I was first married. It was inexpensive entertainment, and I found some great buys. They're all flawed or damaged, but I could see their beauty, even if the owners didn't. I figured they'd be relegated to the garbage heap if no one rescued them. Sort of like that baby bird, and the mysterious little boy, and me. But Keith left the latter thoughts unspoken. His soft comment and the warmth in his eyes played havoc with Jill's equilibrium, and her voice deserted her. But he didn't seem to expect a response. Instead, he headed for the door. I'll gather up another load of dishes, he called over his shoulder. Forcing thoughts about her reaction aside, Jill returned to the table. She needed all her wits about her to deal with Deb's barrage of questions. But to her relief, the conversation stayed on impersonal subjects for the remainder of the meal. Nevertheless, by the time Keith went back to work, Dominic trotting along behind him, Jill was exhausted. She hoped that this wasn't a preview of meals during the rest of Deb's stay. She couldn't handle the tension. The dishwasher was almost loaded when Deb wandered in from the table, nursing the last of her coffee. Jill gave her a quick look, then went back to work. You're mad at me, aren't you? I asked you not to push. I didn't push. I just asked a few questions. You pushed. And why did you have to bring up the rehabbing and my family? I figured he knew at least some of that already. You eat lunch with him every day. Don't you ever talk about yourselves? No, I'm not nosy, unlike some people I know. Jill gave her a pointed look. The word is interested, and all Italians are like that. You're not Italian. After 12 years of being married to Tony, I am Italian by osmosis. But I have to admit that I didn't do very well today. Your guest was quite adept at sidestepping most of my questions. We found out he's a widower, but not much else. How did his wife die? What did he do before he was a carpenter? And did you notice how evasive he was when I asked where he was from? That Missouri answer was vague. Shaking her head, Jill shut the dishwasher and turned it on. Then she faced her sister, folding her arms across her chest. Leave it be, Deb. If he wants to talk, he will. Sometimes people need a little coaxing. If you keep on coaxing, he may stop coming for lunch. A faint furrow appeared on Deb's brow as she mulled that over. You may have a point. Okay, I'll back off a little. A lot. Yeah. By the way, Dominic was right about you. And your look, you know. She dumped the dregs of her coffee in the sink and rinsed the cup. A melancholy look stole over Jill's face as she reached up to touch her cheek. My face is never going to look even close to normal, Deb. We both know that. I wasn't talking about your face. I was talking about your eyes. They do look happier. I wonder why. Without waiting for a response, Deb deposited her cup on the counter and headed upstairs. It was clear she already had her own theory, one that involved Jill's unexpected visitor. In all honesty, Jill couldn't dispute her. Since Keith had walked into her life, she'd felt more alive than she had in 3.5 long, lonely years. Of course, it might not be him so much as the fact that she was simply hungry for human contact. Perhaps anyone would have had the same effect. But if she said that to Deb, she suspected her sister would laugh and tell her to stop kidding herself. And deep in her heart, Jill knew that Deb was right. Keith Michaels was special, and for as long as he inhabited her world, whether it be for 4 weeks or 4 months, she was determined to savor every moment. As for when it came time to say goodbye, she wouldn't think about that just yet. Nor would she analyze why the very thought of his departure made her feel empty and sad. He was back. Since Deb and Dominic's arrival, Jill had seen nothing of the mysterious little boy, but now, 2 days into their visit, he was hovering at the edge of the field, watching as Dominic searched for insects to feed Homer. She'd turned over the baby bird's care to her nephew, who had taken on the responsibility with conscientious diligence. As she watched, Dominic spotted the boy. She told him and Deb about her young visitor, so Dominic didn't seem surprised. Though he was too far away for her to hear, she could tell he was talking to the youngster. When he walked toward him, Jill prepared herself for the inevitable fast exit. But much to her surprise, the little boy didn't run. In fact, as Dominic drew closer, he came out from behind the boulders and took a few tentative steps toward him. Well, well, she mused. So that was a secret to coaxing her mystery visitor into the open. Another child his age. Praise the Lord. Jill rejoiced in the silence of her heart, confident that Dominique could draw him out. Like his mother, he was a people person with the gift of gab. If her nephew couldn't earn the little boy's friendship, she doubted anyone could. Side by side, the contrast between the boys was telling. Dominic wore casual but clean clothes, sized to his frame. The other boy was still dressed in grimy, mismatched attire that hung on his slight physique. Where Dominic looked robust and nurtured, the Mr. Boy seemed underfed and neglected. It was hard to judge his age, but Jill considered Dominic to be about the normal size for a 7-year-old, leading her to speculate that her shorter, more delicate-looking young visitor was about a year younger. Dominic held out the jar of bugs to his new friend, and the boy leaned closer to examine it. Then, with a nod toward the tool shed, Dominic took off. After he had gone several steps, he turned and gestured for the boy to follow. Jill could sense his indecision, as well as his yearning to accept Dominic's invitation. Finally, with a furtive glance over his shoulder toward the woods, he trotted after him. The two boys had to pass Keith, who was laying out some of the framework for the studio walls flat on the ground while the cement cured. Dominic didn't even slow down as he passed, but the other boy hesitated, walking a wild circle around Keith. Jill couldn't see Keith's surprise as he straightened up to stare after the duo. He looked toward the house, almost as if he was wondering whether she'd noticed. When he caught sight of her in the doorway, he smiled. Though he didn't say a word, Jill interpreted his expression to mean, "Looks like there's been a big breakthrough." And I'm happy for you because I know how concerned you've been about the boy. Then she chided herself for reading far too much into his look. For all she knew, Keith was just glad that Dominic had found a friend who would keep him out from underfoot. But in her heart, she knew that her interpretation was correct, and that made her feel good. Too good. She didn't want to start relying on other people to stoke her happiness, especially transient people. For 2 years, since the day she'd stepped onto Orcas Island, she'd been self-contained, content with her seclusion, finding satisfaction in her painting and comfort in her faith. She didn't want that to change. Yet it was. For whatever reason, Keith's arrival had disturbed her placid, secluded world, stirred up emotions that were best left undisturbed, awakened in her a restlessness, a sense that some essential component was missing in her life. The feeling was not only unsettling, but growing, and there didn't seem to be a thing she could do to stop it. When they gathered for their noon meal, Deb had to call Dominic 3 times before he appeared at the door of the tool shed. "Lunch is ready." She motioned for him to join them on the porch. Ducking back inside, he reappeared a few seconds later, tugging on the arm of the reluctant young boy. "Hey, Mom, can George eat with us?" he called. Just then, Jill stepped out on the porch, carrying a large platter of poached, fresh-caught salmon that Deb had brought back from the market after a morning foray into town. "Of course," she responded. "We have plenty." Indecision flickered across the boy's face, and Jill held her breath. When the youngster took a step in their direction, her heart soared with hope. But it was short-lived. When Keith appeared around the corner of the house, the boy pulled his arm free and took off across a field without a backward look. His shoulders drooping with disappointment, Dominique trudged toward the porch, arriving at the same time as Keith. "Hey, buddy, what happened to your friend?" "He doesn't like grown-ups much, I guess." As they settled into their places, Jill offered a blessing before turning her attention to Dominique. "Did you say your friend's name is George?" "That's what I call him." Dominique helped himself to a generous serving of Jill's oven-fried potatoes. Keith wasn't too far behind, as she noticed. "Didn't he tell you his name?" "No, he doesn't talk." Deb cocked her head as she spared a bite of salmon. "What do you mean, he doesn't talk?" Shrugging, Dominique dipped a potato in ketchup. "Like I said, he doesn't talk." "But he was real good with Homer. He got him to eat a bunch of more bugs than I did." "Are you saying he didn't say one word?" Jill stopped eating and looked at Dominic. Nope, that's odd, Jill remarked. Usually you can't get kids to stop talking. I guess he just didn't have anything to say, Dominique reasoned in a matter-of-fact tone. So much for her hopes of learning any more about her mysterious visitor, Jill thought. If anything, his interaction with Dominique had raised more questions. Why didn't he talk? Was it because he couldn't or wouldn't? Why was he afraid to get close to adults? Why did Keith in particular frighten him? No answers were forthcoming, but Jill was determined to find them, sooner or later. In between whale-watching outings and hikes in Morin State Park, Dominic spent every spare minute with George, while Deb relaxed on the back porch, catching up on her reading while keeping an eye on the two boys. Though Dominic tried every day to coax his new friend to stay for lunch, the invitation was always rebuffed. Then Jill had an inspiration. If the little boy who wouldn't come to them at the house, they could go to him on a territory where he felt more comfortable. How about a picnic in the meadow today? She suggested to Deb and Dominique at breakfast. Since you'll be leaving tomorrow morning, we should make our last lunch special. Cool, Dominique enthused. Okay by me, Deb seconded. As long as we don't have to sit on the ground. My sacroiliac can't take that. Don't tell me you're getting old, Jill teased. Mom's already old, Dominic offered. Thanks a lot. Deb gave Jill a disgruntled look. Let me tell you, there's no hiding from the truth when you have kids around. Well, I think we can accommodate you and your old bones, Jill assured her, stifling a smile. And so, at 12:30, Jill and Deb carried the fixings of a gourmet picnic out to the field, near the boulders where Jill had first seen George. They enlisted Keith's help in setting up a portable table and chairs, and while Deb began unpacking the food, Jill spread a checkered cloth on the ground a dozen yards away. What's that for? Deb queried. I thought Dominic might be able to convince George to join us, if they keep their distance. It might help even more if I made myself scarce. I could eat at the house, Keith offered, his gaze fixed on Jill. She gave him an appreciative smile, but shook her head. No. Let's see if this works. Okay, we're set. Deb surveyed the table, cupped her hands around her mouth, and called to Dominic. I'll be right there, Mom. He poked his head around the side of the tool shed and waved. Keith had given Dominic some scrap lumber and shown him how to sand and hammer and measure, and Dominic in turn had shared his new knowledge about George. The two boys had been occupied all morning on the far side of the shed, building a display shelf for Jill's new studio. A couple of minutes later he approached, with George close on his heels. Since Jill had positioned the picnic near the spot in the woods where George entered and exited, he had to walk near them in order to leave. She hoped, when he saw the cloth set apart on the ground and got a good look at the food, he'd be tempted to stay. When they drew close enough to talk about without shouting, Jill spoke. I set a place for you and your friend over there, if you'd like to stay. She gestured toward the checkered cloth on the ground. We have plenty of fried chicken and potato salad and biscuits. And I baked brownies for dessert. Aunt Jill cooks real good, Dominique told George, tugging him along behind him. Come on. After we eat, we can feed Homer and work on the shelf some more. When the boy hesitated, Keith moved to the portable table, choosing a chair that put his back to the young boys. Touched by his sensitivity, Jill sent him a grateful look. The smile he gave her in return warmed her heart. Once Keith was seated, George seemed more inclined to stay for lunch, though his posture was in marked contrast to Dominique's. While her nephew flopped down and reached for a chicken leg, his focus on a V of Canada geese high above, George kept a close eye on Keith, crouching more than sitting, as if he was prepared to bolt at the slightest provocation. His nervousness did diminish during the meal, however. The tense line of his shoulders eased a bit, and once he started eating, Jill was amazed at the quantity of food he had consumed. Dominique had to come to the main table to replenish their supply more than once, and Jill's biscuits disappeared as fast as ice on a hot summer day. Although she was grateful that the boy had ventured closer, the trick would be to sustain his comfort level once Dominique and Deb left tomorrow. Perhaps Homer was the key, she speculated. If George was still willing to come and care for the abandoned bird, then maybe. Kyle, I've been looking everywhere for you, boy. Get back to the house now. Startled out of her reverie by a voice as rough as a heavyweight dust sandpaper she'd used in her rehab project, Jill turned. A grizzled older man stood at the edge of the woods, his ill-fitting clothes grimy and tattered on his burly frame. His eyes were hard and angry, the stubble on his chin coarse, his gray hair uncombed and greasy. He wore a dirty felt hat that looked as if it had been punched and shaken and slept so often that all the stiffness had come out. In the few beats of silence it took Jill to assess the man, the mystery boy sprang to his feet. She transferred her gaze to him at once, noting the sudden fear in his eyes before they went flat. His expression reminded her of a cowed animal, one that had been beaten into submission and expected to be punished for any transgression or perceived transgression, and left with no choice but to comply with its keeper's wishes. As the boy darted towards the woods, his half-eaten brownie forgotten, Jill started to rise, but Keith laid a hand on her shoulder, pressing her back into her seat. Then he stood instead and faced the man, his posturing daring him to lay a hand on the boy as he scurried past. Whether the man had intended to touch the boy or not was uncertain, but if he had been entertaining such thoughts, Keith's look stopped him. After giving the younger man a defiant stare, he turned without another word and clumped off into the woods. For a few moments, stunned silence hung over the small group in the meadow. Dominic scooted toward the adults, his own brownie compressed in his hand, squeezed almost beyond recognition. Who was that? Deb pulled him close, enfolding him in a warm, comforting hug. I don't know, sweetie, but he's gone now. You can sit here by me while we finish our lunch. Except no one felt much like eating, Keith noted in one discerning sweep. The brownies lay untouched on the plates, and a heavy silence hung over the table. Dominique was upset, Deb was concerned, and Jill's distress was almost palpable. Someone needed to try and salvage the situation, and it looked like the task fell to him. Doing his best to smile, he tousled Dominic's hair. Why don't you go show your mom that greedy shelf and great shelf you're building while your aunt and I clean up the picnic? Relief flooded Deb's features. That's a great idea, Dominic. She rose, but Dominic held back, his face troubled. Is George going to be okay? I think his name is Kyle, honey, and that might be his grandpa. He was probably just late for lunch and his grandpa came to find him. Deb's explanation was weak, but Jill hoped Dominic would buy it. She didn't want her nephew to be distressed by the encounter. She was upset enough for both of them. He looked mad. Dominic cast a worried glance towards the wood. And he didn't look like a grandpa. Picturing Tony's gregarious, nurturing, jolly parents, Jill saw Dominique's point. You can't always judge people by the way they look, Keith interjected. When Jill turned to him, she was disconcerted to find him looking at her, not Dominique. He might be a very nice man. Yeah, maybe. Dominic didn't seem or sound convinced. But neither did he seem as upset as before. So, are you going to show me that shelf? Deb prodded. Sure. Come on. Keith showed me how to put the nails in straight, and he said Aunt Jill could use it to hold her supplies, or she could put a picture of me on it to remember our visit. And as his voice receded, Jill drew a shaky breath and turned to find Keith watching her. I didn't especially like the looks of that. His voice was quiet, his eyes steely. Me neither. You said you just started noticing the boy the day I arrived. Yes, that afternoon. I've never seen the older man until today. Although the owner of the neighborhood grocery store did tell me that an old hermit, as she described him, lived on the adjacent property. But no mention of a child? No. He must be a new arrival then. Tears blurred Jill's vision, and she blinked them away. I think he needs help, but I'm not sure what to do. It's difficult to do much unless there's evidence of abuse of some kind. Keith had to intervene in a few of those situations in his prior life, and it had never been easy or pretty. We don't have that. I know. What do you think we should do? He almost said pray, but stopped himself. Let's see if the boy comes back again. Now that the ice is broken, he may warm up to you and start to talk. If he does, he might tell us something that would give us grounds to go to the authorities. If Dominic couldn't get him to talk, I doubt I'll have any better luck. She turned and looked into the shadowy woods. But I'll pray about it. Ask of God to give him some guidance. Her comment didn't surprise Keith. He already knew that Jill had a strong faith. He'd seen the worn Bible she kept in her kitchen. She quoted scripture, prayed before meals, led a godly life. At one time, he too would have turned to God in a situation like this. Except God had stopped listening to him long ago. But maybe he'd listen to Jill. Keith hoped so, because he suspected that Kyle needed all the help he could get.